The Indiana Pacers have surprised a lot of people this season. When many expected them to be at best a play-in team, they now look like a very, very solid playoff team in the Eastern Conference. Don't get me wrong, the 7-5 record is not necessarily outstanding, but they have looked very, very good in their wins and not looked too bad in their losses. They've gotten this success so far this year thanks to their number 2 ranked offense, which is of course led by Tyrese Haliburton, who I think is the NBA's newest point god. Before I get into today's video, I want to talk about our sponsor, Sleeper Fantasy. Do you consider yourself a hardcore NBA fan like me? Do you think that you really do know ball? Well, there is no better way to put that knowledge to the test than with Sleeper Fantasy. Sleeper is a daily fantasy site where you can choose 2 to 8 of your favorite players from pregame, live, or even across different sports. Pick more or less than their predicted stat, and with Sleeper Fantasy, you can get up to 100 times payouts for these predictions, which is pretty insane. And now is the perfect time to check out Sleeper Fantasy because if you use my code RUSTY, you can get an instant deposit match up to $100. Meaning that if you entered $50 into Sleeper Fantasy, they would match it with $50 of their own, and so on. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for further details. They are currently operational in over 25 states. Check out Sleeper today. Thank you to Sleeper Fantasy for sponsoring this video. Tyrese Haliburton so far this season is averaging 23.5 points, 11.5 assists to just 2.3 turnovers. He is shooting 43% from 3 on over 7 attempts a game, and he is currently in the 50-40-90 club. His overall true shooting percentage is 65.5%, which is 8% higher than the league average this year. If these averages end up being what Haliburton's averages are by the end of the year, he will become the first player in NBA history to average 20 plus points and 10 plus assists on 50-40-90 shooting splits. Really, the only player I can think of that got even a little close to this is Steve Nash, because I believe at one point he was 50-40-90 with 19 and like 12, but otherwise Tyrese is in a class of his own. Now, as impressive as all of those numbers are, the thing that really stands out as specifically unique to Tyrese Haliburton is how high his assist total is versus how low his turnover total is. He is up there with the best in the league in terms of total assist to turnover ratio, and when you talk about actual volume of playmaking, it makes him easily the best assist to turnover ratio player in the entire NBA. Tyrese is getting 5 assists for every turnover he has, and that is pretty freaking remarkable. That's just an insane volume of playmaking, and to just not turn the ball over, it's almost magic-like. Not like Magic Johnson, like just the concept of magic. For what it's worth, a low amount of turnovers is not always a positive thing. There's definitely downsides to that. It could definitely mean that your playmaker is just a little bit too afraid to make riskier passes that ultimately need to be made at times. Sometimes the risks are necessary to make and it's not going to work in your favor, and you just have to live with those consequences. You can't be playing just constantly afraid of getting turnovers because you might just not ultimately get anything going for you to begin with because of that. However, for me, when I've watched Tyrese Haliburton, and I've watched almost every Pacers game this year because they're one of my favorite teams to watch, doesn't really feel to me like he's afraid of throwing risky passes. It's not as though he's just limiting himself to what is the most safe possible option. It's more like he just is really, really good at putting the pass right on the money every single time, and his teammates are ready for it. And even if there was a degree of holding back the risk-taking, at the end of the day, Haliburton's passing is resulting in the number 2 offense in the NBA, so you can't really knock him for that. Let's take a look at what the players around him are doing and how they're benefiting each other. Indiana has meticulously built a roster designed to thrive specifically off of Haliburton's playmaking ability. There are multiple shooters on this team, guys that can cut back door, excellent roll options out of the pick and roll. But at the end of the day, there's very, very minimal shot creation on this team outside of Tyrese Haliburton. You have Andrew Nembhard, who's his backup, who's also a pretty damn good passer, and you're getting a little bit of creation from Benedict Mathurin, maybe a little bit out of Miles Turner, but for the most part, these are guys who can finish a play but not really create their own. Miles Turner is averaging 17 points a game. That is the second leading scorer for Indiana after Haliburton. Then there's 13 points a game from Benedict Mathurin. Then there is Buddy Hield, Jalen Smith, Obi Toppin, Aaron Nesmith, and Bruce Brown, all averaging 10 to 11 points apiece. The scoring distribution on this team is pretty freaking remarkable. It's very rare that you find this amount of players on one team averaging double-digit points. Of the 9 players averaging 15 minutes or more for the Pacers this year, 8 of them are averaging double-digit points. And how do they get that scoring distribution? Well, it's through the NBA's newest point guard, and this is what the point of the rest of this video is. Now, the term point guard can obviously be applied to all kinds of different point guards, but the main name that you associate that with is Chris Paul, as that's literally even one of his nicknames on Basketball Reference. Now, just by naming Chris Paul, I can immediately, just through my camera, feel the fingers typing the angry comments from 2 separate directions. So let me just clear a few things up here. The 2 sides are people who are just comically wrong about how good Chris Paul was, and they find it to be an offensive comparison for Tyrese Haliburton. And then there are people who do know how good Chris is, or was rather, thinking that this is offensive to Chris. And for both sides of this equation, I have to ask you, who else would you ever make this comparison with? Because it really could not be more apt. I understand the dislike towards player comparisons, but they are helpful in understanding players, especially in different contexts and different eras. And this is about as good of a comp as you can find. Taking a look at just from a pure number standpoint, it is bananas how similar these guys are. B-A-N-A-S. No, it's not it. B-A-N-A-N-A-S. Whatever. Tyrese is in his 4th season and he is 23 years old. Chris Paul was the same age in his 4th season. Between them, both average 22 to 23 points, both average 11 assists, and both average 3 or less turnovers. But there is minutes and pace to take into consideration here. From a pace perspective, the early 2000s are far slower than they are now. Much more defense, not nearly as much 3-point shooting. So that's a factor to take into consideration for Chris Paul's stats, and for Tyrese's, he's playing 6 minutes less per game than Chris Paul did in 2009. So because of that, we can just get pace and minutes out of the equation by talking about their per 100 stats. Per 100, both averaged 32 to 33 points, both average around 16 assists, and both average 3 to 4 turnovers. So regardless of era, regardless of minutes, their numbers are neck and neck in terms of their production. Looking at their shooting efficiency, we of course have to factor in that Chris Paul was not shooting lights out from 3 at this point in his career, and 3-point shooting in general was just far less emphasized, so he really wasn't even taking that many at that time, especially by comparison to Haliburton's 7 threes per game. Luckily, we can just look at what their shooting efficiency was versus the field in their years versus just looking at raw efficiency regardless of that context. So looking at this from just a pure true shooting perspective, Haliburton this year is at 65.5%, Chris Paul is at 60%. In the modern NBA, that puts Haliburton at 8% above league average efficiency, and in 2009, Chris Paul was 5.5% above league average. So if anything, there's a little bit of an edge for Haliburton, but again, Chris Paul was dealing with less spacing, so I'm not going to knock him too much for it. So at least on the offensive end of the floor, I truly don't think there is a more accurate comparison. They're just remarkably similar. And that goes far beyond the numbers. It's not just how similar the numbers are. Both are excellent shooters. They just utilize their shooting differently according to their time periods. Hallie shoots threes super well. Chris shot mid-range shots very well. Don't get me wrong, Haliburton shoots mid-range shots pretty damn well too, just not as high of a volume as Chris did. And Chris shot the 3-ball ball well enough, just not as on high of a volume as Haliburton did. Neither of them were particularly great slashers. Neither had a very high free throw rate, although I will say in his 4th season specifically, Chris Paul actually peaked in this area in terms of free throw attempts. And in general, there is a sense with the scoring that these two guys provide that they're kind of just doing it when the offense gives it to them, and they're not really hunting for their shot all that much. Either of them on any given night could give you 30 points, but they also don't necessarily need to do that, and they are definitely more pass first players, so they default to that. And of course, both of them are kings of the NBA in terms of assists to turnover ratio, and there's really no other point guard throughout league history that you can think of that really knocks the assist to turnover ratio out of the park as much as Chris Paul did at his peak, and there's no one in the NBA who's doing it as good as Haliburton is right now. Now, the obvious area where Haliburton falls short of Chris Paul and still ultimately ends up being a worse player than Chris Paul was in 2009 is on the defensive end of the floor. CP3 at his peak is probably the best 6 foot and under defender of all time, and Haliburton is fine most of the time. Bad more than he is good, probably. This is reflected in a lot of areas. Where it stands out most significantly is in, at least from a box score perspective, in the steals department. Chris Paul led the league in steals 6 times. He averaged nearly 3 per game in his 4th season, while Hallie is averaging just 1 steal. You would think that the added height and length could make Haliburton a better defender than Chris, but he's just an okay defender, and Chris was just a freaking phenomenal one. But yeah, with that said, at least offensively speaking, Haliburton is as close to Chris Paul as we have ever gotten, maybe ever will get. And honestly, it's a little bit eerie how similar they are, both in the numbers that they produce and in how they produce them. But with that said, shout out to Rudy for editing this video, and goodbye.